Censoring social media, Saudi Arabia orders Snapchat to ban Al Jazeera. Should social media companies bow down to any country's political agenda? And who decides where to draw the line between freedom of expression and silencing the media? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Snapchat is blocking Al Jazeera content in Saudi Arabia. More than 7 million Saudis use Snapchat every day. It is one of the most popular markets for the social media platform in the Middle East. Now the company says it's blocked the Al Jazeera Discover Channel. That's after a request from the Saudi government on the grounds it violates local cybercrime laws. The Al Jazeera TV channel, as well as its news website, are also blocked in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. In response to criticism of censorship, Snap Incorporated responded by saying, "We make an effort to comply with local laws in the countries where we operate." Al Jazeera Snapchat content was as popular in Saudi Arabia as Sky News Arabia and Al Arabiya. Al Jazeera has condemned the ban as an affront to free speech.
Unprecedented. I mean, other countries such as China have tried with Google, and Google said, you know what, we're going to stand by the freedom of expression, and we're out of here. They're the one who have invited us to be one of the exclusive partners, news publishers for the region, because they understand the audience we bring into the mix. And with this move, they're definitely now not allowing our audience on Snapchat to be able to see our content.
Well, let's bring in our panel now. From London, we have Nishanth Sastry, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Informatics at King's College London. From Copenhagen, Pernille Tranberg. She is the co-founder of dataethics.eu. And with me in the studio is Mohamed Elmasry, who is the chairman of the journalism program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Welcome, all of you. So, Nishanth Sastry, let me start with you. Many people will not be surprised that Saudi Arabia is doing this, but they might be surprised at Snapchat's role in all of this. What kind of precedent is this setting, and are they now a party to censorship?
Well, there have been several different cases where different companies have been asked to comply with the various different laws. And this is part of the problem of being a global multinational social media company, is that you have audiences in the USA, in Europe, in the Arab region, across Asia, Australia, everywhere around the world. And so you need to comply with local laws. And in this instance, it appears that Saudi Arabia has asked Snapchat to block a particular channel, in this case, Al Jazeera channel, and then, as your presenter previously said, there's two choices that the company can make. One is it can say, no, I'm out of here because this is not something that I want to be party to, or it can say, I still want to be part of this geographic region, and therefore I'm willing to make whatever requests the government of that region makes of me. And so in this case, it appears that Snapchat has decided that it's going to block Al Jazeera channel. And one thing which should probably we should make a distinction about is where exactly it's blocking Al Jazeera. If it is within just the Arab region, or if it's just within Saudi Arabia, then the government of Saudi Arabia has a legal jurisdiction over it, and therefore perhaps it does have a right to ask Snapchat to do so, but it wouldn't probably be able to say, Snapchat, please block Al Jazeera from USA or Europe or elsewhere in the Arab region, even let's say Egypt or Qatar. So it's entirely possible that the users in the larger Arab region are still being able to receive Snapchat, but just within Saudi Arabia there does appear to be a block on Snapchat.
Pernille Tranberg, what's your view on this? I mean, Snapchat is a private company, and they made a calculation here. But what does this tell us about the Saudi public's right to know?
Well, of course it is. It's a violation of their freedom of speech, and that's what Snapchat is part of. But I'm not surprised about it, and that's what we have to think about, because Snapchat is not a non-governmental organization fighting for our rights to freedom of expression. It's pure business. It's a commercial company, and if they want to do business in Saudi Arabia, they of course listen to the government and don't want to be closed down. So the problem is that as citizens, we often look at Snapchat, Facebook, and all these wonderful platforms as if they're fighting for our rights to democracy. But they are not. They are businesses, and they make hard business calculations, and that's obviously what Snapchat is doing. You can't even say it's kind of violating freedom of speech, because that's what Saudi Arabia is doing. A private company can't really violate.
But isn't Snapchat a party to that by agreeing to what the Saudi government wanted?
Yes, they are. But I wouldn't expect of Snapchat to fight for our rights to freedom of speech. I would never expect that from Snapchat or Facebook or anybody, on any private company like that.
All right. Mohamed Elmasry, should media companies comply with individual governments, or should they be complying with global censorship standards? And if they don't, is that going to hurt their brand name as a business?
Right. When I saw this story, I thought about all the other cases that have arisen over the past several years, and I also thought about all of the extensive literature, the academic literature about the internet and about new media and about social media, and how there's supposed to be this kind of liberating power associated with these new platforms. But what we end up having at the end of the day, at least in many cases, is that power ultimately ends up in the hands of the governments. Now, the companies, as the other guests have said, have a very sort of difficult decision to make. They can either decide to say, well, no, we're not going to compromise on our principles of freedom of expression and we're going to leave this market, or they can decide to play ball, in which case people will say, well, you're sort of compromising your standards and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that these institutions are not fundamentally moral institutions or ethical institutions. They are businesses. They are profit-making enterprises. So what matters at the end of the day is the bottom line. And these companies don't want to lose access to massive markets. We've seen it with other companies. We've seen it just this past year with Apple and Amazon in the Chinese market, compromising, right, for the Chinese government. And we see it here with Snapchat. They don't want to lose access to many millions of users in Saudi Arabia and possibly beyond in the UAE or Egypt or elsewhere.
We'll talk about some of what you just said in a moment, but we'll also want to talk about the way some of these laws have been directed at individuals, because it is illegal to express sympathy for Qatar online in several Gulf countries. In the United Arab Emirates, it can mean up to 15 years in prison and a $136,000 fine. Bahrain has a similar law and a potential 5-year sentence. Along with Saudi Arabia, both Bahrain and the UAE blocked the Qatari sports channel beIN in June. The UAE lifted its ban in mid-July, but the channel remains blacked out in Bahrain and Saudi. So, Mohamed, if I could turn back to you then, what does this move say about the power of the media, and particularly social media in this region?
I think it says a number of things. I think on the one hand, you see that social media sites like Snapchat, like Facebook, Instagram, and others have an inherent power to the extent that governments, to one extent or another, fear them. In this case, you have Saudi Arabia clearly worried about their citizenry resorting to the Facebook, or I'm sorry, the Snapchat channel, the Al Jazeera Snapchat channel. So there is that recognition that these sites have a type of liberating power. Governments, particularly in this region, in the Arab region, are not necessarily fans of people being able to transcend these predefined limits and bounds that exist on freedom of expression. The Saudi Arabian government is quite used to journalists and news organizations towing the government line. They don't necessarily tolerate deviations, and they want to make sure that there is a singular narrative. Snapchat poses a problem. Other sites pose a problem for governments like Saudi Arabia.
Okay, we're going to broaden this out now and talk about some of the previous precedents to this. Social media sites have frequently faced pressure from governments to restrict potentially controversial or sensitive content. Facebook refused an Egyptian government request to block pages on the Arab Spring Revolution 6 years ago. And Facebook complied with a similar request in Pakistan. The telecoms authority there says Facebook has removed 85% of what is considered to be blasphemous content. The Chinese government has completely blocked Facebook since 2009, despite founder Mark Zuckerberg's efforts to change the minds of China's leaders. Twitter's bowed to government requests by geo-blocking specific users depending on where they live. Russian users can't access the page of the political party Right Sector because the Kremlin says it promotes fascism. And Google, along with its subsidiary YouTube, also receives censorship requests from governments. Most are from Russia. So, Pernille, Tranberg, let me turn back to you then. What responsibility do these companies have? I mean, you talked earlier there about their bottom lines and all the rest of it, but doesn't this come with the responsibility to uphold free speech as well?
Well, of course they have responsibilities, but we have to, I think that the big problem is that we have given them too much power, social media. Social media are commercial entities, but for example, traditional media like Al Jazeera or The Guardian or these traditional media companies, they are using social media as distribution. And that's where the problem is, because traditional media will fight this. Traditional media will do everything for the freedom of speech, whereas commercial media, social media, they will do everything for likes and shares and money. And that's fair enough, but of course they do have responsibilities, but they don't want to pay for it. Look at what is happening at Facebook. I mean, all this really horrible stuff coming out of that social media as well. Do they have to stop that or not? I don't. They don't want to pay for that. It would be very, very expensive for them to do content moderation in the same way as a responsible, ethical, traditional media company is doing today.
Nishanth, Sastry, you were saying earlier that Snapchat is trying to comply with the laws of Saudi Arabia, and perhaps in that sense they didn't do anything wrong here, and that people are still free to access Al Jazeera in other ways. But I guess my question is more about the fact that Snapchat has gone along with this policy and the kind of questions it throws up about how reliable they are as a broadcaster of free speech.
Yes. So ultimately, the power is actually, as the previous person said, they are all businesses, but ultimately, and governments do put pressure in various different ways. All parties who have a stake in it will put pressure in various different ways, but ultimately the power still rests in some senses with the people, because what does Snapchat care about? It cares about the people, it cares about its users, it cares about making sure that it has as large a share as it does now, and that its share of users keeps growing. Now, if it's what it says, I think, as a commentary about the Arab region as a whole, is kind of the balance of power between the government and the people, and also the extent to which people care about things like free speech. Now, if somebody tried doing this, say, in the Western Europe or in the USA, there might probably be a larger outcry about the freedom of expression being violated and so forth. The fact that this is not happening, it is happening, but the fact that it's not happening to the extent that it might have happened in the Western world probably says something about what the Arab people care about, or rather the position that they are in right now vis-a-vis the government and their freedoms of expression. And the way I view it is that Snapchat, Facebook, and others are all cold hard businesses, but they are just platforms on which users can express themselves. And the question is whether the governments allow them to express, and the question is whether the users are asserting themselves and their rights and their needs to express. And that is something that's a larger issue than platforms, I think.
Mohamed, there are ways to get around this, aren't there? I mean, if you're tech savvy enough, there are things like VPNs and all the rest of it to access the content that you want.
Yeah, I mean, there are, but as you said, that you have to be particularly tech savvy. And I think that if we look at other cases, what ends up happening is that people that were using Snapchat or accessing Al Jazeera, they'll find another way, to get around the restriction and to access Al Jazeera content one way or another. But looking at it from another perspective, in some ways you could say that the government has already won. In this case, the Saudi Arabian government, because they're forcing people to sort of exert extra effort to access information that arguably should be at their fingertips, regardless of what the government thinks.
Pernille, in the end, is this kind of policy, does it end up being counterproductive, both for governments and for private companies? Won't people always find a way to get the content that they want?
Yes, they will, but it will be the minority. The masses, the majority will be restricted, just like in China. There are lots of Chinese but it's a minority of Chinese who will get access to Western media, for example. So they will have success, I believe, the countries in restricting the masses. But there are ways around, and that's what we could work for then, is helping them to use VPNs until governments will block that.
Nishanth, you were shaking your head a little bit earlier. You don't believe that there are enough ways for people to get around this?
Oh, there are ways. I mean, as a technical person, I can tell you there are hundreds of different ways in which people can get around it. But what it does is it's perpetuating the digital divide. It perpetuates a different, more free way of expression for people who can find these ways around, for people who can create VPNs, for people who know that Snapchat is not the only channel. Maybe there are other different channels. Maybe the Al Jazeera itself can create a completely different channel. And there are numerous stories, for instance, of how dissidents in China are using homonyms to get around the fact that some of the governmental firewall programs are looking for certain dangerous words. So they look for homonyms. They use those words, but not with the spellings that the government would expect them. So there are different ways in which people can get around it. But the point is, it needs us to be clever, creative, and we are expecting us, and we are using our creativity towards getting around these restrictions rather than in finding solutions to the problem, and rather than expressing ourselves, and that I think is a much more larger thing that we should be worried about, because it shouldn't be that we are creating this very nice social and new media infrastructure, and that it's excluding a large proportion of the population who also have things that they want to talk about, things that they care about, things that are important for the rest of the society, and instead we're only enabling people that are able to get around these restrictions, and that's a worrying factor.
Yeah, Mohamed, what about this digital divide then? The fact that you're kind of separating people into the ones who are able to navigate all of these attempts by the government or whoever to block sites, but there are the vast public who aren't as tuned in to this. What does it mean for them?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the professor's absolutely right. I mean, there's a ton of evidence for the digital divide, not only in countries like Saudi Arabia or countries in the Arab region, but even in the United States and in Western Europe and other societies. And it's a big problem because it sort of gets right to the core of what these modern societies are about, which is equality, egalitarianism, and so on and so forth. But yet you have this massive gap between the technological haves and the technological have-nots, or the people who are tech savvy and who can get around government restrictions, and those who can't. So what ends up happening is that you have this massive difference in information and knowledge, and that affects how people make their decisions in democratic societies, but also in non-democratic societies.
Pernille, are we seeing a kind of clash of narratives here in terms of the control of information and our social media? Is this just the case that social media companies are getting caught up in this, particularly in the Middle East?
No, I think it's a problem all over concerning the digital divide we were just talking about. Is really interesting because it's not only a question of getting around government restrictions. It's also a question of getting around economic and political manipulation. For example, just in the Western world, you get totally different prices if you know these different tools like VPNs. And so if you're tech savvy, you can get so many more advantages than if you're not tech savvy. So the problem is all over, also in the Western world.
So, Nishanth, Sastry, ultimately, whose job is it to decide what is acceptable and what is not here?
So ultimately, no one is going to help us. As people, we need to help ourselves. And I think we should stand up for what we believe in. And if we believe that freedom of expression is something that we should fight for, and in some societies, that is a much bigger issue. That is a much bigger plank on which people talk about, on which elections are fought and won. In some other societies, there are other things which are of interest. It may be a traditional way of life. It may be following a certain religion. It might be other things. And we have to decide what is of importance to us and then make our world for ourselves. And in this case, we're talking about an issue of whether or not people are able to express themselves and whether or not other media companies are able to use a social media platform to express themselves. If a certain government says that it can't express, that is not something that's allowed, then it is in some sense expressing a will of the people. Now, I know that Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, so it's not expressing directly the will of its people in that sense, but in the larger modern society, that's kind of how it's supposed to work in theory at least. And if it does not work, then if it's an issue that's very important to us, then we should take to the streets. And it's happened widely. It happened even in the Arab world with the Arab Spring Revolution and so forth. So it's not if it's something that people care about, then it's something that will happen. I think in that sense, I'm an optimist.
Mohamed, if I know this is a little hypothetical perhaps, but if Snapchat had said no to this request from Saudi Arabia, the authorities would likely still have found a way to block it, wouldn't they? And if that's the case, then why did Snapchat agree to it?
Well, look, like I said earlier, they're kind of between a rock and a hard place. If they would have said no, then Saudi Arabia would have blocked Snapchat. All of Snapchat, not just the Al Jazeera channel, but all of Snapchat in Saudi Arabia. So there's the risk of losing quite a lot of business, right? And then there's, we understand that this is part of the blockade against Qatar. So there's the risk of also losing business potentially in the UAE and Egypt and Bahrain and possibly elsewhere. So, for me, I think this underscores that this blockade against Qatar has very little, probably nothing to do with terrorism or fighting terrorism. It's really about information and ideas.
Yes, just briefly, where do you think this fits into the whole GCC crisis at the moment? This is just another kind of layer in there.
Yeah, I think it's more evidence that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt are opposed to Qatar and are opposed to Al Jazeera for ideological reasons, because of ideas, because of independent foreign policy, right? Because of Al Jazeera's independent coverage, sometimes critical coverage of these autocratic governments. It has nothing to do with, the blockade has nothing to do with terrorism or fighting terrorism.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Mohamed Elmasry here in Doha, Nishanth Sastry in London, and Pernille Tranberg in Copenhagen. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime. Just go to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here. Bye for now.